My name is Jonas Wilder, and I never thought I'd be the center of anyone's story, not even my own. Growing up, I was the kind of son who didn't make waves. I didn't rebel, didn't compete, didn't shine. I sat in corners, studied quietly, offered help no one asked for. My younger brother, Miles, had a voice like thunder and a presence to match. He charmed every room, seduced every opportunity, and walked through life as if the rules bent to his will. I was useful, quiet, there. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. That being steady, being good, being dependable would one day mean something. But when my father died, all it meant was that I was convenient to ignore. The will was read in a cold conference room with windows that looked over the Helena skyline. Miles showed up in a tailored suit, sunglasses still perched on his head like the sun never set for him. He leaned back like he owned the building, and maybe he did. I sat near the window, clasping my hands to stop them from trembling. My father's lawyer, Mr. Green, read through the documents like he was apologizing with every sentence. To Miles Wilder, he began, the family estate in Helena, including all assets, furnishings, and the accompanying investment accounts. Miles smirked. I heard him exhale through his nose, that little puff of arrogant satisfaction that made you want to knock it right out of him. Then Mr. Green shifted, his eyes flicking toward me, just for a second. To Jonas Wilder, the property at Stillwater Ridge, located in Granite County, Montana. No other assets assigned. There was a silence in the room that buzzed like a Helden laugh. My heart pounded, not in anger, just disbelief. Stillwater Ridge? I didn't even know we owned anything there. That place had never come up in conversation. Not once. I looked at the line of text on the document in front of me and reread it, hoping maybe I'd misunderstood. But no. No hidden line. No footnote. Just a single line that felt like being erased from a chalkboard. Clarissa didn't even wait until we got home to unravel. As soon as we stepped outside into the parking garage, she turned on me, face stiff with fury. Are you serious? A shack in the woods? That's what your father thought of you? Her voice echoed off the concrete walls, sharper than the slap she didn't bother giving. I tried to explain I didn't expect anything, that I hadn't gone into that room believing I'd walk out rich. But Clarissa wasn't listening. Her rage wasn't about surprise, it was about disappointment, about shame, about being married to the son who didn't matter. She shoved a duffel bag into my chest, one I recognized from our last camping trip years ago. Go, she said flatly. Go see your little cabin. Maybe you'll find your balls in the attic. And don't bother coming back until you do. I stood there, stunned, heart jackhammering, unable to speak. I think part of me had known this was coming. Not the bag, maybe. Not the words. But the fracture. The truth. She never loved me. Not really. I was a placeholder. A background character she thought she could mold into a man worth showing off. And when that molding failed, when I didn't transform into a version she could parade through charity dinners, she blamed the clay, not the sculptor. I drove out of Helena with the windows down and a numbness crawling across my ribs. It wasn't just the wind. It was the silence in my chest, the kind that feels like grief but doesn't deserve the word. It's the quiet that comes when you realize no one's ever really looked at you and seen someone worthy. The last will of a cold man had done its job, carved the family into categories, the heir and the afterthought. Stillwater Ridge wasn't even on the map on my car's GPS. I had to dig through glove compartment clutter to find an old road atlas from college, trace a blue vein of highway out into forest, then smaller roads into mountains, and then onto dirt tracks that barely passed for public access. I didn't go straight there that night. I parked on the side of the road just short of the last marked town, curled into the back seat with my coat as a blanket, and stared at the stars. They didn't look different. The world didn't feel new, but I did. Slightly. A shift, maybe. A fracture line becoming visible under my skin. The next morning, I bought gas, filled a thermos with burnt coffee, and headed deeper into Montana's wilderness. Stillwater Ridge wasn't even a town. It was more like a memory someone had tried to bury. When I finally turned onto the path leading to the house, if it could still be called that, I felt the gravel crunch beneath the tires like bones. Trees leaned in close, their limbs thick and suspicious, and the air had a bite that felt older than weather. The house appeared like a secret at the end of the road, gray, sagging, forgotten. Shutters hung crooked. The porch was wrapped in vines, as if nature had tried to strangle it years ago and then gave up out of pity. I stepped out of the car, my boots sinking into soft dirt. The wind stirred through the trees, whistling through the gaps in the boards like it knew I didn't belong. I stood there, just breathing, looking at the place I now apparently owned. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel rage. I felt curious. Who had built this? Why had my father kept it hidden? What kind of story had been locked away out here while we were busy pretending Helena was the whole world? I walked up the steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The door creaked open with a reluctant push. Inside, it was dust and shadows. A few broken chairs, a cracked fireplace, a thick coat of stillness like it had been waiting for me specifically. I didn't know it then, but the house wasn't just a shack. It was a key, a question, a test, and somehow it had chosen me, not because I was strong or worthy, but maybe because I was the only one willing to listen. I dropped my bag to the floor and sat on the edge of an old trunk by the window, watching the wind carve invisible stories through the grass. I had been forgotten, overlooked, but maybe that wasn't the end of the sentence. Maybe it was the beginning. The road to Stillwater Ridge stopped pretending to be a road about 20 minutes after the last highway sign. What was left was a jagged vein of gravel and overgrown brush that snaked through trees too proud to be trimmed. The map had already given up on me. My GPS kept spinning like it was searching for a signal in a place time forgot. I should have been nervous. Instead, there was a strange calm in my chest, like the world had finally gone quiet enough for me to hear myself breathe. I gripped the wheel tighter and followed the last sliver of usable path until the house reemerged like a ghost I hadn't properly greeted. It hadn't gotten any prettier overnight. The wood siding was bowed from decades of weather and rot. A shutter clung to a rusted hinge, creaking in the wind like it was trying to whisper something. I stepped out of the car and let the door shut behind me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the porch, watching my step, half expecting the whole thing to give way. But the boards held. Barely. Inside, the musty air greeted me like an old coat closet, stale, thick, and layered with history I hadn't lived. I turned on my phone's flashlight and moved deeper. The living room was empty save for a collapsed armchair and a cast-iron stove in the corner. Dust coated everything, dulling even the smallest glints of light. There were no photos, no furniture worth keeping, just the bare bones of a house that once mattered to someone. I found a bedroom with faded wallpaper peeling like old skin, and a bathroom with a cracked mirror that showed a version of me I didn't want to recognize. Tired, unsure, a man chasing shadows just to feel like he hadn't been completely erased. But it wasn't until I reached the back of the house that things shifted. That was where I found the door. It was recessed into the wall like it had been added after everything else was built. Thicker than the others, darker too. Though it wasn't rotting, it was solid. Deep walnut maybe, but aged into something almost black. Carved into its surface were symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't decorative. They were deliberate. Geometric spirals, crossed feathers, circles with bisecting lines. I reached out and ran my fingers along them, tracing the grooves. They were too precise to be random, too intentional to be dismissed. There was no handle, just a keyhole. I tried every key I had. None fit. The door didn't even rattle when I pushed against it. It stood firm, silent, like it was waiting for something more than a locksmith. The air felt different near it, cooler somehow. I stood there a long time, just staring, trying to make sense of why my father would leave me this. Not the property, not the neglect, but this door. This locked, carved secret at the heart of the house. It wasn't just a room. It was a message. I spent the next hour tearing through every drawer, cabinet, and loose panel I could find. Most of what I uncovered was junk, rusted nails, mouse droppings, cracked ceramic. I almost gave up when I tripped over a warped floorboard in the back hallway. I knelt down and pried it loose. Beneath it was a crawlspace entrance covered with a thin sheet of plywood and old nails. I yanked it up and aimed my flashlight inside. The opening was small, too small for comfort, but not impossible. The air that came up from below was colder than the rest of the house, and it carried a scent of earth and decay. I lowered myself in. The tunnel wasn't natural. Wooden slats reinforced the walls, some marked with faint chalk lines. I had to crawl on my elbows, scraping my shoulders on rough beams. My flashlight flickered once, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't die. After about 10 feet, the tunnel widened slightly, and I found myself in a room, no windows, no light, just silence. My heart thudded in my ears as I stood, brushing dirt from my jeans. The room had been hidden for a reason. It was old, older than the rest of the house. The walls were lined with stone, not timber, and the ceiling had beams I didn't recognize, thicker, almost ceremonial. And in the center of it all was a table. On it sat a chest, roughly the size of a toolbox, carved with a bird that looked like a hawk mid-flight. The image wasn't just etched, it was embedded, like someone had poured their spirit into the work. I approached slowly, not sure if I was trespassing in my own inheritance. Before I opened the chest, I paused and just looked. The room wasn't dusty like the rest of the house. It was preserved, as if someone had been here recently. Or maybe it had been sealed so tight that time hadn't been allowed to do its usual damage. I lifted the latch. Inside the chest was a bundle wrapped in cloth, delicate, aged, but still intact. Beneath it, a leather-bound book. Thick, worn. Its cover was cracked, its spine frayed. But the name etched into the front stopped me cold. Matthias Wilder. I froze, fingers brushing the cover. My grandfather. A man I had never met. A man my father never spoke of. I opened the book carefully, flipping past pages filled with elegant, looping script. It wasn't a diary. It was a record. A history. Maybe even a confession. The first page read, "For the one who chooses to listen. Blood is memory. Memory is duty." My throat tightened. The writing continued, page after page, stories of a people I barely knew. Our people. The Okeefe-Sakowing. The Seven Council Fires. Stories of sacred lands, of ceremonies held under moonlight, of loss and survival and quiet strength. There were drawings of headdresses, notes about songs passed from one generation to the next, warnings about forgetting. The cloth bundle contained smaller relics. A beaded necklace. A feather painted red at the tip. A worn pouch filled with dried herbs and bone. These weren't just trinkets. They were sacred. Symbols of something I had never been told about. Something I had never been trusted with. Until now. I sat down on the floor, book in my lap, and felt something unfamiliar tighten in my chest. Not grief, not anger. A strange, sacred awe. My father had locked away our history, buried it beneath dust and indifference. But my grandfather had tried to preserve it, had carved a space for it. For me, the forgotten son. The wind outside howled louder than before, battering the walls above. But down here it was quiet. Down here it was sacred. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with what I'd found, not yet. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The map had ended, sure. But maybe that was the point. Some paths don't need roads. Some journeys only begin where the lines stop. I don't know how long I sat there in that stone-walled room, the book heavy in my hands, the air thicker than it should have been for a space with no life in it. It wasn't just the weight of the leather-bound pages that anchored me. It was what was inside. The more I turned the pages, the more I felt like a trespasser, like I was touching something I wasn't supposed to. But I kept reading. I couldn't stop. The name on the cover, Matthias Wilder, was like a fire I hadn't realized had been smoldering inside me all along, and now it had caught the pages in my chest alike. Each page was written with precision, like every word mattered. Not a journal, not a list, something in between. A record. A legacy. Matthias wrote about the tribe we descended from, the Okeefe-Sakowing, the Seven Council Fires. He detailed customs I'd never heard of, ceremonies I couldn't begin to pronounce, lineages that made my name feel like it belonged to something older than myself. He wrote of hardship, of things stolen, land, language, dignity, and of the quiet resistance that came not with guns, but with remembering. He hadn't been trying to preserve a collection. He'd been preserving a heartbeat. And then there was the chest. I turned back to it, slowly peeling back the folds of aged cloth tucked inside. Each item felt like a question that had been waiting 100 years for me to answer it. First, the ceremonial drums, small, hand-stitched leather stretched across carved wooden frames, painted with symbols that pulsed with meaning even if I didn't yet know what they meant. I traced the lines with my fingertips, expecting dust, decay, but instead I felt warmth. Not literal heat, but something quieter. Presence. Purpose. Next were the feathered headdresses. There were 3, each one distinct. One with long eagle feathers arranged in a fan, decorated with red and black beadwork. Another smaller, adorned with fur and quills, meant for a child or ceremonial offering, perhaps. The last one, tattered at the edges, but beautiful in its ruin, was the kind you didn't wear lightly. Not a costume, not a decoration. It was something a leader might have worn, or a warrior, or a healer. I didn't know. Not yet. But I knew it mattered. And somehow, by sitting here and touching it, I was supposed to understand that. At the bottom of the chest were the war beads, woven strands of bone and sinew in colored glass, still strung on faded cords. Some had tiny etched markings, patterns that looked like stars or birds. Others were rough, primitive, and chipped with time. I picked up one strand, held it in my palm, and felt a lump in my throat. These beads had been worn, carried, maybe even bled on. They weren't for show. They were stories, told without words, and I didn't know a single one of them yet. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures, but even as I did, something in me recoiled. The camera lens felt invasive, like a stranger in a sacred room. I slipped the phone away and sat back against the wall, the book open on my lap. Matthias had ended one entry with a line that echoed in my chest louder than the wind howling through the upper floorboards. When memory is outlawed, silence becomes a tomb. Do not let this house become another burial. He knew. Somehow, he knew this house would be forgotten. That his son, my father, would bury it, ignore it, pass over it in favor of a polished house and bank accounts and appearances. And he knew that one day someone might come back. Someone like me. Someone unwanted by the world he came from. Maybe even someone broken. The thought sat with me, heavier than the chest. I'd been angry when I arrived. At my father. At Clarissa. At life. I thought I'd been given scraps. I thought Stillwater Ridge was a punishment. But maybe I'd misunderstood everything. Maybe this wasn't exile, it was an invitation. I closed the chest gently, wrapping each item back in its cloth, my hands almost trembling with care. Then I sat cross-legged in front of the book and began reading out loud. Just to hear the words. Just to let the silence know it wasn't winning. The drum is not an instrument. It is a mouth. It speaks when we no longer have breath. It calls spirits, honors the dead, and reminds the living who they are. I paused. Something about saying it made it real. Like I wasn't just learning. I was remembering something I didn't know I'd forgotten. I read another line, then another. And somewhere between the fifth and sixth, I began to cry. I didn't sob. I didn't wail. The tears just came, silently, as if the grief had been stored in my bones this whole time, and now it had found a door. I don't know how long I stayed down there. Hours maybe. The flashlight battery finally died, leaving me in a darkness that should have scared me but didn't. I didn't move right away. I just sat there, chest rising and falling, surrounded by the presence of people I never met and yet belonged to. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't being overlooked. I was exactly where I needed to be. Not because I was brave, not because I was strong, but because I stayed, because I listened. Eventually, I crawled back through the narrow passage, the cold dirt brushing against my shoulders like a farewell and a promise. I emerged in the hallway, blinking at the pale light slipping in through the cracked windows. Dust danced in it, weightless and slow. I went back to the door with the carved symbols and looked at it again. This time, I didn't try to open it. I just placed my hand flat against the surface and whispered, "I see you now." And in the stillness that followed, something shifted. Not the door. Not the wind. Me. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew I wouldn't sell the house. I wouldn't call Clarissa. I wouldn't run back to Helena with my tail between my legs and a story about a dead man's old junk. No, I'd stay. I'd clean the dust, learn the names, read every page. I'd figure out who Matthias was and who I was meant to be, because buried in the dark, in that chest, wasn't just history. It was identity, and maybe even redemption. I didn't sleep much that night. Even after climbing out of the crawl space, after carefully rewrapping each sacred item and sealing the chest again, I felt like something inside me had been kicked awake. I lay on the old cot I dragged into the least broken room of the house, staring at the cracked ceiling with its jagged veins of time. Every creak of wood and rustle of wind seemed to carry voices, not ghostly, not frightening, just ancient, familiar, like someone was humming an old lullaby I used to know. I didn't recognize the words, but the melody made my bones ache. By sunrise, I decided. I needed help. Not to sell, not to profit, but to understand. So I called the one person I trusted outside the world that had discarded me, Dr. Calvin Rich. We'd met at a conference in Missoula years ago, back when I still believed. Had a future in financial planning, and he was lecturing about tribal history and preservation. We'd bonded over late-night coffee and quiet jokes about academia's arrogance. Calvin had a calmness about him, the kind that made you want to whisper even in broad daylight. When I dialed his number, my hands trembled, but he answered on the second ring. Jonas. His voice was groggy but curious. Cal, I said, my voice hoarse. I need you to see something. Something important. Can you come up to Stillwater Ridge? He paused. Stillwater Ridge? As in the ghost parcel in your family's records. Yeah, I said. Turns out it's not so empty. He didn't ask questions. Just said, give me 5 hours. He showed up in 4.5. I watched from the porch as his SUV pulled up the dirt path, kicking up dust that shimmered in the late morning sun. He stepped out in his hiking boots and denim jacket, hair wind-tousled, glasses already slipping down his nose. Well, he said, looking up at the sagging house. This place has character. I smiled. It was the first real one I'd had in days. Inside, I led him to the crawlspace. I could tell from his silence that the atmosphere was working on him too. Some places don't need to announce their importance. They hum with it. Calvin followed me into the hidden room, his flashlight casting long shadows against the stone walls. When he saw the chest, he stopped. Jonas, he whispered, almost reverently. What is this? I didn't speak. I let him open it. Let him peel back the cloth and lift the drum, the necklace, the headdress. His fingers shook slightly as he examined each item. When he opened the book and read Matthias Wilder's name, he closed his eyes for a long moment and exhaled. These aren't artifacts, he murmured. They're anchors. Living history. He sat on the ground with the book in his lap and flipped through the pages like he was reading scripture. Every so often he muttered phrases to himself, Dakota words, Lakota, references to traditions I only half understood. Then he looked up at me, eyes shining. Jonas, this collection, it's not just rare. It's priceless. These items weren't meant to be preserved in glass cases. They were meant to be passed on, taught, lived. I know, I said quietly. That's why I called you. He didn't ask what I planned to do. He didn't offer to take it off my hands. Instead, he stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. This is a gift, he said. Not from your father. From your grandfather. From every ancestor who was afraid their story would die in silence. We spent the rest of the day cataloging each item, carefully, with gloves, notes, photographs taken with solemn purpose. Calvin took samples of the cloth to identify the age and origin. He jotted down phrases from Matthias's book, some of which matched oral histories passed through other tribes, but never written down. The implications were massive. You could sell this, he said at one point, not unkindly. Millions. Easily. Private collectors, universities, even national museums would line up. I looked at the chest, at the beadwork and feathers, at the fading ink in my grandfather's hand. But then it's gone, I said. Behind glass. Owned, not honored. I can't do that. Calvin nodded, his face unreadable. Good, because that would have broken something sacred. That night, after he left, I lit a fire in the old cast-iron stove using dried pine and some kindling I found under the porch. The house groaned and cracked as it adjusted to the warmth. I sat on the floor near the fire and held Matthias's book in my lap. I read aloud, slow and steady, teaching myself the shape of each word, the sound of it in the dark. The pages began to feel less like history and more like inheritance. And then I dreamed. I was standing on a high cliff overlooking an endless plain. The sky was painted in fire, sunset or sunrise, I couldn't tell. Herds of buffalo thundered below, moving like rivers of muscle and memory. A wind swept past me, lifting my hair, my spirit. And beside me stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, hair braided with bone and bead. He didn't look at me, just kept watching the land. But I knew it was Matthias. Somehow I knew. You're not lost, he said without moving his lips. You were just buried. I turned to speak, but I woke up. The fire had died to coals. The wind outside had calmed. But inside me, something had changed. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the property, tracing old boundaries, discovering weathered stones that might have once been markers. I took notes, mapped it by hand, then sat under the largest tree. An old cottonwood that looked like it had seen a century of storms, and thought about what it would mean to stay. Not for money, not for revenge, but for purpose, for connection. That was when I made my decision. I would not be a keeper of things. I would be a keeper of meaning. The chest didn't belong in a private vault. The drums weren't meant to be muted. The feathers weren't meant to gather dust. These weren't riches in the way the world defined them, but they were wealth all the same. The kind you didn't spend, the kind you lived. I wasn't sure how I'd do it yet, but I knew the answer wasn't in Helena. It wasn't in Clarissa's spiteful eyes or Miles's smug grin. It was here, in the bones of this land, in the fire of these stories. I wasn't forgotten. I was chosen, and this time, I would not be quiet. I should have known she'd come back. The moment Calvin published his preliminary findings, just a few academic notes on cultural significance and tribal relevance. The news trickled out like water through cracked stone. A blog picked it up. Then a regional museum director mentioned it in a panel. Undocumented artifacts found on private Montana property potentially linked to the Okeechobee-Sakowing. I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before someone treated it less like preservation and more like opportunity. And that someone would be Clarissa. It was late afternoon when I saw the black SUV kick up the gravel at the edge of the ridge. Sunlight hit the chrome grille like it was announcing royalty. She stepped out wearing heels. Of course she did. Leather boots would have made sense, but Clarissa never did anything that made sense if it meant bending to someone else's world. Her long black coat flared in the breeze, her hair pulled into a sleek ponytail. She looked like she was arriving at a gallery opening, not a decaying house on a mountain. I stayed on the porch, leaning against one of the support beams I'd recently reinforced. She didn't greet me, just walked up with tight, rapid steps like the gravel beneath her feet had offended her. "Well," she said, eyes scanning the porch, then the chip paint on the railings, "looks like the dump got an upgrade." I didn't answer. She waited for sarcasm. I gave her silence. She finally looked at me, really looked. Her eyes darted across my face, as if searching for the man she left behind. But I wasn't standing there with a duffel bag in my arms anymore. I wasn't asking her to understand. I wasn't asking for anything. "I saw the article," she said, shifting her stance. "People are saying the collection is worth millions. You just gonna sit on that in this rat trap while our lives burn down?" I pushed off the beam and walked down the steps toward her, slow and even. "No one's burning anything, except maybe your sense of decency." That stung. She covered it with a scoff. "Don't be dramatic, Jonas. This," she gestured toward the house, "could be your shot. Our shot. You finally get something worth something and your plan is to keep it in a box underground like a lunatic? We could sell it. Buy a real house. Get back on our feet." I stared at her like she'd grown two heads. "Clarissa, the only thing you've ever cared about is how I look on your arm. The image. The appearance. You think those drums, those feathers, those relics are a lottery ticket. But they're not. They're history. My family's. My tribe's. Not yours to exploit. Not yours to spin into a real estate pitch." "Oh, give me a break," she snapped. "You didn't even know your grandfather's name 6 months ago. Now suddenly you're a cultural custodian." I stepped closer, and my voice dropped low. "I didn't know because I wasn't told. Because people like my father erase the past to build their polished futures. I'm not doing that. Not for you. Not for money. And not for ego." She paused, taken aback by my tone. For once, I didn't feel small under her gaze. I felt anchored. "Think about Miles," she said next, softer, trying a different angle. "He has everything. You've always been left behind. Always the one with crumbs. This could change that. We could show him." I laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just a quiet, honest laugh that came from a place she clearly didn't understand. "I don't need to prove anything to Miles, or to my father, or to you. If that's what you came here for, you can turn around." Her eyes narrowed, but I saw the flicker of doubt behind them. She didn't expect this version of me. The one who didn't flinch when she raised her voice. The one who stood taller even though nothing about me physically had changed. She walked past me and headed for the door like she still had a right. I moved to block her. "No, you're not going to let me inside?" she asked, blinking like the word insulted her. "No," I said again. "This isn't your place anymore. Jonas, you left." I cut in. "You tossed a bag at me and told me not to come back until I found my spine. Well, here I am. And now you don't like what I found." Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. I watched her struggle, really struggle, for something to say that could cut me again. But the blade was dull now. Her power was gone. She was just a woman in expensive clothes standing on a mountain she didn't understand. "Fine," she hissed, stepping back. "Stay in your dusty little museum. Rot with the old bones. But don't come crawling back when you realize you've thrown your life away. I didn't even blink. I didn't throw anything away. I'm finally holding on to something that matters. She stormed toward her car, heels stabbing into the dirt like angry punctuation marks. When the door slammed shut, it echoed down the ridge. She gunned the engine, kicked up a trail of dust, and disappeared into the trees. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was peaceful. I stood there for a long time after she left, watching the road, waiting to see if she'd turn around. She didn't. I walked back inside and closed the door, leaning against it as the old hinges groaned. The chest was still exactly where I left it, untouched, waiting. And in that moment, I realized I didn't feel bitter. Not even a little. I wasn't angry at Clarissa. She did what she always did, tried to turn meaning into currency. And I finally did what I should have done years ago, said no. That night, I sat by the fire again, Matthias's book open on my lap. I flipped to a page I hadn't noticed before. It read, "There will be those who see only profit in the feathers. But you must see the flight." I smiled. Clarissa saw feathers. I saw the sky. I was repairing the eastern window frame when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel again. At first, I thought Clarissa had returned for round two, maybe with a more convincing argument or legal paperwork folded in a faux apology. But when I stepped onto the porch, wiping sawdust from my palms, I saw a different kind of stranger altogether. The vehicle was sleek. Black, polished, humming quietly with expensive confidence. And when the driver's door opened, the man who stepped out looked like he'd been airdropped from some boardroom 3 time zones away. He wore a gray 3-piece suit, the kind pressed so sharply it looked like it could cut glass. No mud on his shoes, no dust on his slacks. His briefcase was leather, thick and old, but well-kept, like him. He had the kind of face you don't remember in detail, just the vague impression of authority, of calculation. He approached with an unhurried gait, like this mountain was just another meeting location on his itinerary. "Mr. Wilder?" he asked, stopping at the base of the porch steps. I nodded. "That's me. I'm Alden Roth," he said, lifting the briefcase slightly, like it was a badge. "I represent several clients with a keen interest in culturally significant artifacts, particularly those with deep ancestral ties." His voice was smooth, almost too smooth. A politician's smile without the politics. I didn't say anything, just waited. "I believe you're in possession of items," he continued, "belonging to the O'Keefe-Sackawing lineage, items of considerable historical and cultural value. My client would like to make you an offer." "How do you even find me?" I asked, arms folded now. He smiled again, without blinking. "Good research travels fast, especially when the subject is irreplaceable." I stepped down a single stair, enough to look him directly in the eye. "And what exactly does your client want?" "To preserve history," he said, with a sincerity so practiced it made my stomach turn. "Our organization funds private acquisitions that are cataloged, documented, and eventually donated to major institutions. Museums, universities, places where these stories can be remembered." "That's so?" He nodded, undoing the clasp on the briefcase and flipping it open like a magician revealing a trick. Inside, papers, glossy folders, a silver pen, and a check. I didn't look at the amount, not yet. "For $1 million, he said flatly. "For the collection in its entirety, conditional upon authentication and safe transfer." I let that number hang in the air. For $1 million. Enough to buy a dozen homes. Erase every financial bruise Clarissa and I had ever earned. Start over anywhere. I could already hear her voice in my head, trying to twist it. This could fix everything. But I didn't look at the check. I looked at him. "And what happens to the items after your client gets them?" I asked. "Put behind glass? Locked in a basement vault until someone deems it the right time to display them." He was good. Barely flinched. "They'll be preserved. Protected. Viewed by thousands. But not felt," I said. "Not lived." "Mr. Wilder," he said, voice dipping into something softer now, as if he pitied my naivety. "These relics are delicate. The world is not kind to what it doesn't understand. Wouldn't you rather they be protected than risked?" "By risk, you mean shared," I said. "Taught. Celebrated. Not owned." He raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "Men like you usually regret walking away from this kind of offer." "And men like you," I replied, "usually don't expect to be told no." He stared at me then, silent. The wind shifted between us. Not harsh, not gentle, just present. like the land was watching. "I'm not going to ask again," he said. "This is a rare offer. A kind one. You won't get it twice." "I'm not interested," I said, and meant it. "You can take your briefcase, your client, and your kind offer back to wherever you came from." The answer's no. He waited, like he didn't quite believe me, like he was giving me one more second to come to my senses. When I didn't speak again, he slowly closed the case, adjusted his cuffs, and stepped off the porch. But just before he reached his car, he turned back. "You think this land protects you. But you're alone here, Mr. Wilder. Be careful what you value. It can be used against you." It wasn't a threat. Not directly. But it sat in the air like one. I didn't respond. I just watched as he climbed into his car, engine humming like a well-fed beast, and drove back down the path with a grace that didn't belong in these woods. After he left, I walked to the chest again, unlocked it, laid each item out carefully: the drum, the beads, the feathered headdresses, and then the book, Matthias's voice etched into time. I turned to the passage I had marked the night before. There will always be men who want the story without the spirit, who want the bones but not the blood. Never give them both. I ran my fingers along the edge of the page. For million. The number still echoed in my head, but it was hollow now. Empty. Because money could never translate what I had found here, what I was beginning to understand. These weren't just items. They were echoes. And some echoes are too sacred to be sold. That evening, I lit a small fire outside, just a ring of stone and kindling. I sat near it and thought about how easy it would have been to say yes, to hand over the burden, to go back to the life I used to think I wanted. But I also thought about what it meant to carry something not for profit, but for protection, for preservation not behind glass, but through breath, memory, voice. The stars came out one by one, and the mountain whispered nothing at all, just peace. And I knew then this wasn't about holding onto the past. It was about honoring it so the future could stand. The morning after Alden Roth left, the mountain felt different. Not threatened, not afraid, just resolved. As if the land had been holding its breath during his visit, and now, with his expensive shoes gone from its soil, it could exhale again. I walked the perimeter of the house with a new urgency, not out of fear but out of purpose. Something had shifted in me. It wasn't just about keeping the items safe anymore. It was about sharing them. Rightly, honorably. Not behind glass, not for money, but for meaning. I called Elias Stone 2 hours later. I'd met him once before at a tribal heritage event at Bozeman, years ago when I was still just the forgettable Wilder brother in a pressed shirt, tagging along behind Clarissa's social ambitions. Elias had been there as a speaker, a keeper of stories. Back then, I hadn't said much to him, just listened from the back of the room and clapped politely. But his words had stayed with me. So when I called him, half expecting to be ignored, I was stunned when he answered on the first ring. "This is Elias." I introduced myself, not sure if he'd remember me. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "Stillwater Rich. I've heard whispers." That was all it took. He agreed to visit that weekend. When Elias arrived, he didn't park close like others had. He left his truck at the foot of the hill and walked the rest of the way, slow and deliberate. He was in his 60s, his silver braid falling past his shoulders, his long coat dusted with road and wind. He didn't shake my hand when he reached the porch. He just looked at me, into me, as if searching through my skin for something hidden. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice gravel and warmth, "was a complicated man, but he loved this land." I nodded, not knowing what to say. "There's something I need to show you." I led him to the crawl space, offered to go first, but he waved me off. I was crawling through root cellars before you had teeth. He ducked in and disappeared into the dark like he was returning to an old home. I followed, heart hammering. When we entered the hidden room and I opened the chest, Elias didn't gasp. He didn't flinch. He went still. He knelt in front of the open lid and lifted the feathered headdress with a reverence that made my throat tighten. He held it in both hands like it was a child. Then he cried. No sound, no sob, just tears falling silently down weathered cheeks. I didn't speak. I didn't dare. "These aren't just things," he finally said, placing the headdress gently back. "They're memory, spirit. They were never lost, just waiting for the right person to listen." We sat in silence for a long while, Elias tracing the beadwork, murmuring soft phrases in Lakota I didn't understand but felt in my bones. When we emerged from the crawl space, he asked me to walk the land with him. We circled the house. We went into the woods. He paused under the cottonwood and placed a palm against its bark. Here, he said. This land holds story. It wants to be more than a resting place. And that was how it began. We started making calls. Elias reached out to tribal leaders, historians, cultural artisans. I cleared the land around the house, tore out the rotting porch, replaced the beams with salvage pine. Word spread faster than I anticipated. Volunteers came, some curious, some cautious, already. We called it the Wilder Heritage Center. It sounded odd at first, my name attached to something so sacred. But Elias insisted. You carry the thread, he said. Honor it by not pretending it doesn't run through you. Layla Hawk arrived next. A local artisan with deft hands and a fierceness behind her eyes that rivaled the mountain winds. She asked to see the beads. Not to wear them, not to touch, just to see. When I unwrapped them, she didn't speak for a full 5 minutes. Then she said, I want to teach the children what these meant, and what they still mean. We cleaned out one of the old storage buildings on the property and turned it into a studio. Layla filled it with looms, threads, tools. Children from nearby reservations began showing up every week. She taught them to weave the old patterns, chevrons, stars, spirals, not just for art, but for language. Each thread had a sound, a story, a direction. Meanwhile, I kept working on the house. We turned one of the main rooms into a gallery, not for tourists, not for profit, but for truth. Elias brought in other artifacts on loan. Others donated oral histories. We painted the walls with symbols Matthias had drawn in his book. I stood in that room one evening, watching the way the light fell across the new floorboards, and felt like I'd stepped into a space my grandfather had dreamed of but never lived to see. We held our first community event a month later. Not an opening ceremony. A gathering. No suits. No tickets. Just songs. Drumming. Food shared around fires. Elders spoke. Children danced. A language I didn't yet know surrounded me, cradled me, and I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like a student. A relative. A thread being woven back into a tapestry I didn't realize I'd been cut from. I spent every day learning. Elias taught me words, some soft, some sharp. Layla taught me stitches, the weight of thread, the patience it took to let color speak. I repaired the outer walls of the house with a quiet purpose I'd never felt before. Each nail I hammered in didn't feel like labor, it felt like apology. And the house began to respond. The creaks became softer. The wind stopped pushing so hard against the boards. We installed solar panels and insulation. Not to modernize the house, but to protect it. We built walking trails marked with plaques explaining the significance of trees, of stones, of forgotten symbols carved into bark and granite. The land came alive beneath our hands. And through it all, I kept Matthias's book close. I read it at night by lantern light. His words became more than memory. They became compass and spine. He had not written as a man desperate to be remembered, but as one who hoped the right heart would one day take up the fire. I had thought myself forgotten, but I was simply late to the calling. On a cool morning as frost kissed the fields, Elias stood beside me near the cottonwood. We watched a group of teenagers practicing the ghost dance in the clearing, their voices rising and falling like a heartbeat. This, Elias said, is what survival looks like. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. I felt like a man who had finally come home. I knew he'd come eventually. There's something about the scent of legacy that draws wolves. And my brother Miles, he'd always been a wolf in cufflinks, all grin and calculation, hungry not because he needed, but because he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else having more. When the media coverage surrounding the Wilder Heritage Center gained traction, when the articles started referring to the land as a living archive and culturally transformative, I imagined Miles reading them with a tumbler of scotch in hand, tapping his fingers against the glass, calculating. He didn't call ahead. He never did. One afternoon, I saw a silver luxury sedan crawl up the dirt road, its tires protesting every rock and rut. He stepped out, impeccable as ever. Dark tailored suit, crisp white shirt, not a speck of dust on him. The same smirk played on his face, the one that used to get him out of detention and into boardrooms. But this time, I didn't feel small when I saw it. I felt something else. Older. Sharper. Jonas, he called, striding up the path like he owned it. You've certainly transformed the place. I didn't smile. I didn't offer my hand. You're on private property, I said flatly. Family property, he corrected, with that voice that always pretended to be reasonable while burying the knife. Which brings me to why I'm here. Of course it did. He took a thin folder from under his arm and handed it to me like it was a peace offering. Legal documents. A letter from his attorney. A claim of confusing bequeathal, citing that the Montana property had not been clearly delineated from joint family holdings and might be considered contestable under probate law. "You're wasting your time," I said after skimming the first page. "I've already filed the paperwork to register the land and contents under cultural heritage protection. The items are no longer personal property. They're tribal assets in a pending trust." He looked surprised for half a second, then impressed. Well, Big Brother found his spine after all. I ignored the jab. "You're not getting the house. Or what's inside." His smile faltered, then returned thinner. "This is about more than a house, Jonas. You're sitting on history. You think you're the only one who deserves to decide what happens to it. This land has value. The artifacts have value. Don't be selfish." I laughed, and it startled him. Selfish? Coming from you? You inherited Dad's house, his accounts, his business contacts. And you're here, not because you need anything, but because you can't stand the idea that I was left something that matters. He didn't deny it. He just straightened his jacket. "Look, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to propose a deal. Split the land. I take over the legal half market value, of course. You run your little center. You get the public goodwill, the tribal praise, the man of the people badge. I develop the rest. We both win. You want to build condos next to a cultural site? Eco-lodges," he said smoothly. "Luxury experiences. Think bigger, Jonas. People would pay thousands for a night in a curated, authentic setting like this. You could even run the programming. Be the face." I stared at him, wondering how many versions of the word no he'd have to hear before he stopped repackaging it as an opportunity. "This isn't a theme park," I said. "It's a sacred site. A place of restoration. It's not for sale. Not for branding. Not for your ego." He stepped closer, voice lower. "You think people won't dig? You think when the news cycle turns they won't start asking questions about authenticity, about rightful ownership, about you? You're barely connected to this heritage, Jonas. You didn't grow up with it. You didn't earn it. You just found it. I didn't flinch. And you think that makes it yours instead?" His jaw twitched. "No, but it doesn't make it only yours." That was miles in a sentence. If he couldn't own it, he'd try to break it. If he couldn't have the spotlight, he'd knock out the bulbs. I turned away, folding the documents and setting them on the porch rail. "If you want to take this to court, go ahead. But you won't win. And even if you did, what would it give you? A house you don't understand. A story that isn't yours. And a community that would turn their backs on you before you finished your first press release." Miles looked at me for a long time. Then he stepped back, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. "You really believe you're something now, don't you?" "No," I said, "but I believe in something now. And that's more than I ever could say before." He left with a final smirk, no handshake, no goodbye. The car disappeared down the path in a haze of dust. A week later, we were in court. He filed a motion, just as promised. Challenged the inheritance, the designation of the land, the use of artifacts without family consensus. His lawyer was polished, articulate, and entirely out of touch. I stood in front of the judge, no suit, just my work clothes and a folder containing records, affidavits, letters from Elias, Layla, and tribal leaders. I didn't beg. I didn't plea. I just told the truth. "These aren't assets," I said. "They're breath. They're memory. They're the living history of people who've lost too much already. You wouldn't sell your ancestors. And I won't sell mine." Miles barely looked at me. The judge listened, carefully, and then ruled in my favor. The property remained under my care. The items, officially registered under the Wilder Heritage Trust, were to be maintained in collaboration with the Tribal Council. Outside the courthouse, I saw Miles speaking to a reporter, spinning his loss into rhetoric about miscommunication and legal clarification. I didn't interrupt. I had nothing left to prove to him. When I returned to Stillwater Ridge, the wind was waiting. I walked the trail behind the house and stood beneath the cottonwood. Layla had hung a row of woven sashes between the branches, each made by the children in her class. They fluttered in the breeze like prayers. I closed my eyes and placed my palm against the bark. I had defended this place, not just in court, but in the quiet places of my soul where I'd once believed I was nothing. Now I knew better. The wolves would always come, but the land would always remember who stood. The first time I heard a child call it the Wilder Center, I froze. It came from a small boy named Aiden, maybe 8 years old, tugging at his mother's hand as they approached the front porch. "Mama, can we go to Wilder today? I want to see the story drums." I was near the door, hammer in one hand, paint-smeared rag in the other, and something about the way he said it, carefree, excited, like it was just a normal place in his life now, brought a lump to my throat. The name had always felt heavy to me. Wilder. My father wore it like a crown. Miles like a brand. And me? For most of my life, it had felt more like a shadow I could never quite step out of. But that day, something shifted. It wasn't just a surname anymore. It was becoming something else. A space. A shelter. A living pulse. We officially opened the Wilder Heritage Center in the fall, timed with the changing of the leaves in the annual harvest ceremonies. It wasn't a grand unveiling. No red ribbons or press conferences. Just song, circle, and fire. Elias led the opening prayer in his native tongue, his voice quaking under the weight of generations. Layla placed the first woven tapestry over the entrance, a piece stitched by the children in her class, each strand representing one of the 7 council fires. The house, now repaired and humming with breath again, welcomed people not with polished perfection, but with warmth and honesty. Inside, we'd organized everything with care. The front room served as a gallery, not static, not dead, but dynamic. Every item had a story card, but more importantly, every card had a QR code linked to a spoken oral history, recorded in both English and Lakota. The drums weren't just displayed. They were played every morning by a local youth group who had formed a practice circle on the porch. The headdresses remained untouched, respectfully cased, but central to every tour. I never said, "Look at this." I said, "Listen to what this means." We turned the kitchen into a language room. Every week, Elias or one of the elders came in to teach greetings, chants, and blessings. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, mimicking syllables, their laughter bouncing off the once empty walls like a healing echo. I started learning too slowly. Every phrase I mastered felt like another stitch pulling me into the tapestry my grandfather once feared would unravel completely. I never pretended to be a scholar or a savior. I introduced myself during every tour the same way. "My name is Jonas Wilder. I'm not an expert. I'm a listener. This land chose me, and I chose to stay." People came from all over, some with curiosity, others with reverence. Teachers brought classes. Grandparents brought grandchildren. Former skeptics came too, their skepticism softening as they walked through the rooms. Some left donations. Most left changed. The community began leaving things for us. Offerings. Small tokens. A handmade doll wrapped in a blue cloth, left quietly by an elder who wouldn't speak above a whisper. A bundle of sweetgrass from a woman who said her grandfather had once hunted near these woods. One day, I found a carved wooden pendant placed gently on the porch railing. It was shaped like a hawk mid-flight, the same image etched into Matthias's chest. No note, just legacy, passed hand to hand. I spent most evenings in the reading room. What used to be the old bedroom, now lined with shelves of tribal records, Matthias's writings, books donated by visiting professors. I kept his leather-bound book behind glass, but I read it often, still. Sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. His voice had become my compass. Clarissa never returned, and I no longer imagined she would. Miles never called again, either. The court ruling had ended things legally, but it also fractured whatever final strand remained between us. I wasn't bitter. I didn't need revenge. I had land beneath my feet and names in my heart that he would never care to know. One afternoon, I sat beneath the cottonwood, watching the wind ripple through the prayer ribbons Layla and the children had strung between the branches. Each ribbon bore a word they had learned, a name, a prayer, a promise. They danced in the air like pieces of song, and I thought, this is what it means to plant something and let it grow. Elias joined me, sitting on the ground without a word, pulling out a pipe wrapped in deerskin. He lit it carefully, slowly, and passed it to me. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand conversation because everything that needs saying is already understood. After a while, he spoke. "Your grandfather would be proud." I nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I hope so. You've done something rare here, Jonas. You didn't just uncover history. You gave it back. And in doing so, you gave yourself back." I didn't respond, but my throat tightened. As the sun began to sink behind the ridge, casting gold across the porch beams. I stood and walked to the front of the house. I touched the edge of the sign we'd carved together, the Wilder Heritage Center, its letters burned into salvage pine. Below it, we'd added a smaller inscription, Kikswiapi Kihi Omnisai Yapi, remembering together. Elias had chosen the phrase. I hadn't known the full translation until the night before we opened. That evening, I stood with a group of visiting teenagers on the porch. One asked me what I used to do before all this. I was a banker, I said, in a suit, behind a desk. He looked at me, puzzled. Why'd you leave? I looked around. The trees, the house, the people. I could hear laughter in the weaving room, drumming from the porch, footsteps on the trail. Because here, I said, the sky never ends. They didn't understand then. Maybe not fully. But someday they would. Because this place wasn't just a house anymore. It was a name that meant something. A home that held memory and offered belonging. It had taken losing everything I thought mattered to realize what truly did. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of legacy. Not what's given, but what's finally claimed. The snow began to fall softly that night, like it didn't want to interrupt the quiet that had settled across Stillwater Ridge. I stood outside under the wide sky, bundled in the wool coat Layla had insisted I take when the cold came early. The house behind me glowed with life, warm lights in the windows, laughter spilling from the weaving room, the muffled rhythm of a drum being practiced in the main hall. A year ago, I wouldn't have believed this scene could exist, not for me. A year ago, I was the man who stood forgotten in the shadows of his own family. Now, I was something else entirely. Not louder, not richer, just fuller. Clarissa never came back. She didn't write, didn't call, didn't even send the obligatory legal letters. It was as if she had closed the book on me the moment she walked out, convinced she'd never need to read that chapter again. But I didn't carry anger for her anymore. I didn't carry anything heavy. The grief had burned itself out somewhere between the courtroom and the cottonwood tree. It left space behind, space I hadn't realized I needed. Miles had vanished too. He had tried to challenge what I was building, tried to rewrite the inheritance into something transactional, but when the court closed its doors and the land stood still in my name, he stopped calling. I think, deep down, he knew he'd lost not to me, but to something older than both of us. And that was a defeat even he couldn't spin. But not everything was silence. The land had a voice now, and it spoke daily. Children traced patterns in snow with their boots, practicing dances they'd learned around the fire. Elders gathered in the main room, sipping tea and telling stories that hadn't been told out loud in decades. The weaving room had a waiting list. We added a new trail behind the center, marked by hand-carved totems, each one made by a student in Layla's heritage class. We weren't just preserving history anymore, we were living it. I had changed, too. Not in the way I walked or spoke, but in the way I stood still. I no longer waited for someone to hand me permission to matter. I no longer looked over my shoulder to see if someone was finally proud of me. I had become proud of myself, not for being perfect, but for being present, for choosing, every day, to stay, to carry forward what so many before me had been forced to bury. Inside the house, Elias and Layla were preparing for the winter gathering. It was the last big event before the snows deepened and the roads became impassable. People were coming from 3 states over, some for ceremony, some just to reconnect. I'd cleared out the back shed for overflow lodging and brought an extra firewood. The house felt ready. The land, too. I touched the feather Elias had given me, a single red-tipped hawk feather tied to a strand of rawhide, a symbol he said meant chosen guardian. I kept it in my coat pocket now, not as a badge, but as a reminder that the responsibility wasn't just to protect, but to listen, to teach, to keep the doors open. Behind me, someone knocked gently on the porch post. Almost ready? Layla asked, stepping out beside me. She had snow in her braids and paint on her sleeves. Almost, I said. Just watching the sky do its thing. She followed my gaze. You know, I didn't think you'd last out here. Neither did I. And now, I smiled. Now I can't imagine leaving. She nodded once, as if she already knew the answer. Then she turned and walked back in, calling over her shoulder. We need more chairs by the fire. And no, you don't get to avoid the cleanup this time. I laughed. A real one. As I followed her inside, I looked once more at the horizon. The snow was falling harder now, but still quiet, still gentle. And in that hush, I heard something. Not a voice, not a whisper, just a knowing. I hadn't been thrown away. I had been planted. And in this cold, quiet place, I had grown.